Hi, welcome to Challenge JP. My name is Jacek, and today I'm going to show you how to create a customer churn and revenue forecast dashboard in Microsoft Power BI.
Before we start looking into the detail of how to create our dashboard, let's look at the final Power BI file. So as you can see, I divided the dashboard into 4 reporting pages. The first page, Actuals, simply shows the monthly breakdown of users with new signups, churn customers, the resulting ending customer number, and then the calculated churn. My next page, Cohort Retention, looks at the heat map that analyzes the retention of users by the cohorts. Then the next page also looks at the retention, but this time we can group the users together by either selecting cohorts that the user belongs to or by limiting the sign-up date range. Finally, our forecast page will allow us to create projections based on the number of new users, churn, and monthly revenues. Throughout my video, I will be referring to my web tutorial, and you can find a link to this tutorial at the description of this video, which will be the basis of our course. So if I scroll it down, you'll see here that I'm going to have 12 steps. The first set of steps will deal with loading the data, transforming in, and finally creating a data model. There will be a foundation for creating a DAX measures and visuals that will allow us to analyze our customer signups, cancellations, and churn. And then finally, with this analysis in place, we'll be able to create a set of DAX measures combined with those parameters to create a forecast for our users, churn, and revenue. You see here that you can also preview the dashboard and download the completed file, which includes the Power BI file, data source files, and the DAX measures. Okay, so let's start with our step 1, which deals with loading and transforming our customer data. I will start from an empty Power BI file, which will allow me to show you how to load the data on a step-by-step basis, and then finally create a data model. And then I'll be switching between my completed file and also this web tutorial to start introducing new DAX measures and a further analysis. Okay, so let's go to an empty Power BI file. And I'm going to start loading data. To load the first set of data, I will go to the report view and then click on the Get Data icon in the Home tab. Get the text CSV, and this will take me to my data folder where I hold my customer data sets. So as you can see here, I'm going to be using 4 data sets. Cancellations data, which hold the information about the cancellations of my customers. Customer lookup, which will hold information about my customers. Pricing plan lookup, and the signups data. This file contains information about new customers and the details of the signups. Okay, let's start from my signups data. So I'm going to click on the signups data file, and then I'm going to click on Open. And then I'm going to click on the Transform Data to open my Power Query Editor. The Power Query Editor allows me to inspect the data to make sure, for example, that my data type or customer ID is in numerical format, for signup date is in the date format, and that the pricing plan is in a text format. Before I close my Power Query Editor here, I actually want to create additional column. You see that the sign-up date contains dates and the time. For the purpose of my future calculations, I want to create a column that only contains dates and it ignores the time. So in order to do it, I'm going to click on that column, and then I'm going to go to my Add Column tab, and then click on the date, and then select Date Only. Once I click on that, you see another column, which is called date at the moment. So I'm just going to double click on that and change the name to sign up date. So I'm going to go to Home and then click on the Close and Apply. And now if I go to the right side of my report view, click on the data pane, you should see that signups data loaded and appearing in that pane. Let's load another set of data. So again, I'm going to go to a Get Data, text CSV, and then this time I'm going to select the cancellations data, and then I'm going to click on Transform Data again. This data set holds 2 columns. One is the customer ID and the other one is the cancellation date. The customer ID is exactly the same customer ID that you will see in our signups data. So this is one of the columns that will allow us to match our cancellations with the signup users. Now, for the cancellations date, just to be consistent with the signups data, I want to create another column also with dates only. So I'm going to click on this column, go to the Add Column tab, and then select Date and then Date Only. And now with that, I can go to my Home tab, I can select Close and Apply, and then you should see those cancellations data also appearing in our data pane. Let's go to, again, Get Data, text CSV, and then this time I'm going to load Customer Lookup Table. And then you see we have 4 columns with Customer ID, first name, last name, and email. And then you see this Customer Lookup Table appearing in our data pane. Okay, I have one more data set to load. So I will click on the Get Data, again a text CSV, and then I'm going to select this Pricing Plan Lookup. Transform Data, and then you see that here I have just 2 columns, one with the pricing plan, So we're just using here plan 1, plan 2, and then monthly price, which is 20 and 35. I don't need to make any transformations. So I'm just going to click on close and apply. Okay, so now let's go to a model view in our Power BI file. And then you should see those 4 tables appearing with the corresponding fields. So now I want to start setting up our data model. In order to do it, I'm going to move the signups data slightly below here, the same with consolations data, and then leave my lookup data just where they are above. Now, before I start creating my first links, I want to add one custom table, namely my calendar table. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce a DAX dimension. And then if we go to my tutorial, you will see that here, after all the instructions on how to load the data, there was another step with an auto-generated calendar table. So this DAX code creates a calendar with a minimum and maximum values driven by our signups data and cancellation data tables. And then it extends that maximum date by 5 additional years to accommodate the forecast that we'll be creating. Now, in addition to that, I'm also going to use this add columns function, which will create columns that will help me with my calculations and DAX measures later in my tutorial. So now I'm going to copy that code, go back to my practice sheet, and then while in the Home tab, I'm going to create on New Table icon. And you will see now the name of the measure appearing in this formula bar. So I'm going to replace it with my calendar code and then click on Commit. You should see that that creates additional table called calendar with all the columns that we specify in our code. Now I want to click on those 3 dots next to the name of the table and then make sure that I select Mark as Date Table option. I'm going to switch it on and I'm going to select a date as my date column. Click Save, and now we can start linking those tables together. So I'm going to move the calendar table also above somewhere here. And now I'm going to start linking my calendar table and customer lookup table with my signups data and cancellations data. So let's start with the calendar table. I'm going to click on the date field, and then I'm going to drag it and drop it over the sign up date field. And here I have to make sure that my cardinality is one to many, cross filter direction is single, and my relationship is active. I'm going to click on Save. And you'll see that here I have my first link. Now I'm going to go back to my date field for my calendar, and I'm going to drop it over cancellation date field in my cancellations data table. And again, I have to make sure that my flow goes from calendar to cancellation data, one-to-many cardinality, single cross filter direction, and then this relationship is active. Now, going to my customer lookup, if you recall, the common column between the signups data, cancellations data, and customer lookup is that customer ID. So I'm going to click on the customer ID from my customer lookup table and then drag it and drop it over customer ID in my signups data table. And here again, I have to make sure that the flow is from customer lookup to the signups data. The cardinality is one-to-many, cross-filter direction should be single, and the relationship is active. And then again, I'm going to repeat the same step, this time for customer lookup and cancellation data. So again, I'm going to click on the customer ID from my customer lookup table, and then I'm going to drop it over customer ID in my cancellations data. Now, I want to create a link for my pricing plan lookup table, but before I do that, I want to add a DAX custom column to my customer lookup table. So to do that, I'm going to go back to my web tutorial. And again, you can find a link to this tutorial at the description of this video. And then in the step 4, here I talk about calculated columns, which will allow us to create our customer cohort analysis. So first of all, I want to create this column called first sign up date. So I'm going to copy that code, and then I'll go back to my practice sheet. And then this time I have to make sure that I select customer lookup table, and then I'm going to click on the new column icon. I can paste my measure in my formula bar and then click on commit. And now you should see that first sign up date column appearing in my customer lookup table. Let's switch to the table view so we can see exactly what's happening. So what you see here is our customer lookup table with the first 4 original columns. So the customer ID, first name, last name, and email, and this additional column that shows the first sign up date. So if I click on this column, you see the DAX measures that we created. And again, this DAX measure goes to the signups data table and looks up the sign up date for a given customer ID. Now I want to create another column, which will give me a month of the sign up. And this is something I'm going to be using for a cohort analysis in the next steps of this tutorial. So I'm going back to my web tutorial, and I'm going to copy that sign up cohort date measure. And then by going to my table tools and creating new column, I can create a new DAX column. So I'm going to paste my new measure and then click on commit. So you can see that sign up cohort date column goes to that first sign up date column and then converts the date to the first day of a given month. Then I want to go back to my tutorial, and this time I want to add a sign up cohort label. So I'm going to copy that measure, go back to my practice sheet, again, go to the table tools, click on new column, paste my measure, and then click commit. And then you can see from this measure that this column goes to the sign up cohort date and then changes the format so it shows the year first and the month later. That column will allow us to visualize and label our cohorts in the next step of our analysis. And then finally, I want to go back to my tutorial. And then you see here that I have a final column called sign up plan. So I'm going to copy that, click on a new column, and then paste my code. You should see that now I'm showing the plan that a given user sign up for. Now we can go to our model view again. And now I can link the pricing plan from the pricing plan lookup to that sign up plan in my customer lookup table. So again, I'm going to drag that pricing plan. So again, I have to make sure that the flow is working correctly. So it goes from a pricing plan lookup to the customer lookup. Cardinality is one to many, cross filter direction single, and the relationship is active. And then I'm going to click on save. Okay, and that completes our data model setup. Now, if we go back to my tutorial, you see that now we are ready to start creating our first DAX measures to analyze basic customer information and then turn into a meaningful churn and retention analysis. Before we look into the first set of DAX measures, let's go back to our practice sheet so we can create one more table. This time it's going to be repository for our calculations and measures. So while I'm on the report view, I'm going to go to a home tab, and then this time I'm going to click on enter data. You should see that create table box, and now I can go to the name field and I can change the name of the table to measures table. Click on load. In order to create a measure, I'm simply going to right click on that measures table and then select new measure. You should now see a new measure name appear in the formula bar. So let's go back to my tutorial and then let's start copying the first couple of measures. So our first measure here is actuals fact max date. This is a helper measure that will allow us to check what was the last date based on our actuals date. So I'm going to copy this measure, go back to my practice sheet, and then paste it in my formula bar. And you should now see that actual facts max date measure appearing under our measure table. Now, before we continue, I'm going to right click on that column 1 field, and I'm going to delete it from the model. And you should now see that that measures table moved to the top and it's changed its icon to a calculator. Now, if I want to add another measure, again, I'm going to right click on that measures table name, and then I'm going to select new measure. I will go back to my web tutorial, and now I'm going to copy my second measure, which represents new actual signup by counting distinct customer IDs from my signups data. And then I'm going to paste it again. I'm going to hit enter, and now you should see that actual new signups measure appearing also under our measures table. Let's go back one more time to the tutorial, and now I'm going to copy another measure. This time is actual churn customers. So this measure represents a distinct count of the customer IDs, but this time from the cancellation data table. Go back to my practice sheet, again, right click on the measures table, and then select new measure option. Paste the measure. You should now see our measure also appearing in our measures. We're actually ready to create our first visual, but before we do that, let's go to our model view. And now you should see that if I select this actual churn customers measure and I open my properties pane, there's going to be a field called display folder. So if I click on that field and I simply type in actuals, hit enter, you should now see actuals folder within our measures table, which hold this actual churn customer measure. So this is just another level of organization, which is useful, especially if you're planning to have quite a few measures. Let's go back to our report view. And now I want to create a simple matrix that shows me the number of new customers or new signups in a given month and the number of churn customers in the same month. Then select matrix from my visual gallery. In my rows, I want to add a field from my calendar table. So this is that table that we created earlier when we were setting up the data model. And then I'm going to add that year month field, which, as you can see in our metrics, appears in our rows. Now, as my values, I want to add the two last measures that we just created. So I'm going to expand that measures table, and also I'm going to expand that actuals folder. And then first I'm going to select that actual new signups measure, and then I'm going to select that churn customers measure. Let's go to our matrix, expand it a little bit, change the width, change the height, and now we can see that we have our basic monthly summary of the new customers signing up in a given month, and also of the customers that we lost. Now, if I go to my finished dashboard, you will see that our matrix here has also two additional columns, which is the active customers and the churn rate. And in addition to that, we have a slicer and a graph that helps us visualize our analysis further. And then if I scroll down here, you'll see our another measure is the actual cumulative signups. Now the next measure, actual cumulative cancels, counts the number of cumulative cancellations. So the signups measure refers to the signups data, and the cancellations measure refers to the cancellations data. Now, with those two measures in place, we can calculate the number of active customers by simply taking the number of cumulative signups and then deducting from it number of cumulative cancellation. And that's the measure that you're going to see in the third column of our matrix. And then here I have another measure, the actual beginning of month active number of customers, which gives me a number of active customers at the beginning of the month. This measure allows me then to calculate my churn rate, which is simply the number of actual churn customers divided by that actual beginning of month active user measure. And that churn rate measure is represented as our fourth column in our matrix. In addition to that, I've also inserted a slicer with the calendar year as the field, and then formatted as a slider, which you can do by going to a format pane, slicer settings, and then by selecting between folder style. Now, my next slicer allows me to select my pricing. So here I'm using the pricing plan field from the pricing plan lookup table. And while the slider above allows me to limit the range of dates that I want to analyze, this slicer here allows me to select the plan that I want to look at. I'm also using a line and cluster column chart to represent the number of new signups in my columns, and then the number of churn customers in my line. Finally, for my annual analysis, I want to make sure that for my rows, I'm using year field from my calendar table, so all the numbers are aggregated on the annual basis. And now we can move on to the step 7, which deals with analyzing customer churn and retention by cohort. So here we want to move to the second report page, which is that cohort retention, and we want to create that heat map, which shows how well we retain customers depending on the sign up month. So first, let's create another table that will help us to set up our matrix. We're going to call it Cohort H, and I'm simply going to copy it. And then let's go back to my practice sheet. I'm going to click on the table view, and then in the table tools tab, I'm going to select new table icon. Now in my bar here, I'm going to paste my measure. You should now see that Cohort H table appearing in our data pane. And you can see here that this table simply consists of values from 0 to 60 with an increment of 1. Let's go back to my tutorial, and we can look at the measures that we need to create by a given cohort. So that new measure, cohort size, simply calculates the number of initial users in a given cohort. The next measure, actuals cancels to date, calculates the number of customers that have canceled so far by a given cohort. And then finally, we have actual active at age measure, and that simply calculates the number of users that have remained in the service. And then finally, in order to calculate our retention percentage, we need to take the number of active users and then divide it by that number of initial users in a given cohort. So what you initially see here is just a matrix with a heat map, but actually underneath that sit our measures. So if I click on that matrix and then we click on the setup, you will see that for my rows, I'm using that sign up cohort label field from our customer lookup table. For my columns, I'm using value from that cohort H table that we just created a few moments ago. And then for the values, I'm using that actual retention percentage measure, which is the last measure that we just created. Let's go to the format pane to the right so you can see how I've created this heat map. After you open the format pane, go to the cell elements, and then if we scroll down, you should see that I pick retention percentage as a series that I want to apply the settings to. In addition to that, you should see that I've switched on conditional formatting for the background color and for the font color. So if I switch it off, you should now see those numbers, which are just percentages. Those numbers represent customer retention by the given cohort. And now all I had to do in order to create this heat map was to switch on the conditional formatting for the background color first. Go to the conditional formatting setup by clicking on that FX icon. I then selected the gradient for my style, but then I changed the minimum, so the lowest value is represented by white, and then I selected one of the blues to represent the highest color. Then I click OK. And now all I have to do is repeat exactly the same setup for my font color. So again, I'm going to switch on the conditional formatting for the font color, go to that FX icon, and then keep the gradient as my format style. But again, apply the same colors for my minimum. So in our case, it was white. And then for the maximum, I'm going to use the same blue as I use for my background color. And then if I click on OK, that's going to ensure that the colors for the background and for the font are in sync. Now, finally, before we get to our forecast, let's go to another page. So here we also will be looking at the customer retention percentage, but this time we want to aggregate the cohorts together. So in order to do it, I've inserted the area chart. And then if we look at the setup of this chart, you will see that for the x-axis, I'm still looking at the value field from that cohort H table that we created earlier. For my legend, I'm using the pricing plan field from that pricing plan lookup table. And then for the retention, I'm using the actual retention percentage by a curve measure. So if I click on that measure here, you will see that in order to calculate this number, I have to take the actual active at H curve measure and then divide it by actual cohort size at H curve measure. The difference between those set of measures and the matrix measures is that here we need to aggregate the numbers together depending on the cohort age. You will see here that I've added a slicer with my slider so I can limit the sign up date range. And then here I've used the slicer with the vertical list and that sign up cohort label column from the customer lookup table so you can limit your analysis to a specific cohort. In addition to that, using my format pane, I've added that zoom slider to my chart, and you can do that by expanding that zoom slider section, switching it on, and then selecting x-axis, and that way you can zoom in or zoom out your timeline. With the customer actuals and cohort analysis, we can go back to my tutorial and then start introducing forecast measures. Okay, before we create our first forecast DAX measure, let me introduce you to a Power BI parameter. This Power BI parameter or set of parameters will be the base of the sliders, which you see on the forecast reporting page. In order to create a parameter, let's go back to my practice sheet. And here, while I'm in the reporting view, I'm going to click on the modeling tab, and then I'm going to go to a new parameter icon and then select numeric range. You will now see a box with a number of fields. So we want to start with the name. And I'm going to type in MRR plan 1 for this parameter. MRR stands for the monthly recurring revenue. You can call it also pricing. For the data type, I'm going to choose decimal number. We're going to keep the minimum at 0, so we can't go lower than that. And then for the maximum, let's say I'm going to set it at 100. For the increment, I'm going to choose 1. And then let's put 20 for the default value or whatever is suitable for your model. Now I'm going to uncheck the add slicer to this page box, and then let's click on create. To the right in our data pane, you should see that MRR plan 1 parameter. Now, in order to add that slicer, we need to go to our insert tab, go to the visual gallery, and then select slicer. In the setup of the slicer, let's click on add data, and then we're going to add that MRR plan 1 parameter. And now you should see a slicer with that slider inside. And then if you move the slider, you will see the value changes from 0 towards 100, which follows our setups. And as you will see here, I've created a set of parameters here. So in order to do it, I had to repeat this step several times and then make sure you name the parameters and change the value accordingly. So in our forecast, we'll be dealing with MRR for plan 1, which is that monthly recurring revenue. That's something that we use as our example. Then we have also MRR or monthly pricing for plan 2. I also want to be able to set monthly churn for plan 1 and different monthly churn for plan 2. Then I want to here determine the percentage of users on plan 1, which will allocate the remainder of users to plan 2. Growth period determines the number of years in which we'll be growing our users. And the total new users at month 1, that's the starting number of users at the beginning of our forecast. And then the target new users per month, that's the target number of users by the end of our forecast. Now we're ready to start creating our forecast DAX measures, and you will see that those DAX measures will be referring to our parameter values in order to calculate the right user and revenue numbers. So let's go back to my tutorial. And again, you can find a link to this page at the description of this video. And we're on the step 10, which was dealing with setting up those parameters. So we've just done that. And then if I scroll down, you'll see that here I'm listing the set of parameters that we want to introduce in our model. So those are those parameters or slicers that I've just gone through. And now let's start defining our first DAX forecast measures. So the first measure is the assumption churn rate. And this measure selects the churn rate from our parameter, either for pricing plan 1 or pricing plan 2, as defined here by P1 or P2. depending on the sign-up plan selection in our visual. Similarly, if we scroll down here, you'll see that here I have an assumption for MRR, so our monthly recurring revenue. And again, based on the selection of the plan, we're either going to choose the MRR for pricing plan 1 or pricing plan 2. Moving forward, we also have an assumption for the percentage share of new users. Here I'm also converting some of the growth parameters to a monthly value. So you'll see here that I'm taking our yearly value for the growth years parameter and multiply by 12. With those helper measures, I am now ready to start creating my forecast DAX measures. So this first measure, forecast new customers, it simply looks at this initial value of the new users and then the target value of the new users, combines that with that growth years or growth months parameter, and it determines the number of users in a given forecast month. In the next step, I want to create another measure which basically takes those number of total new users and then it allocates it to either pricing plan 1 or pricing plan 2 according to that assumptions new share measure. My next forecast calculation is that forecast BOM active projected measure. And that measure calculates the number of new users at the beginning of each month. It's a long measure, but in a nutshell, it splits the calculation in two parts. The first part calculates the number of surviving users based on the churn rate and the number of actual users from the last actual period. And then the second part of the calculation deals with calculating the number of surviving users based on the number of new users and also our churn assumptions. Having that beginning of month number of users, we can now calculate the number of churn users by simply taking the churn rate assumption and then multiplying it by beginning of month number of active users. And then finally, in order to calculate the number of active users at the end of the month, we take the users from the beginning of the month, we adjust this number by the forecasted number of churn user, and then we add the new users as defined by that forecast new per plan measure. Now, in order to calculate my monthly revenue, I want to take the number of active users at the end of the month and then multiply it by our MRR assumption. So again, that MRR assumption is driven by one of our pricing parameters, which you can see here. So as you can see here in the rows, I added year month field from our calendar table. That's the table that we created at the beginning of this tutorial. In my column, I've added pricing plan field from the pricing plan lookup. If we go back to our matrix, you see that for the values, I'm using those user BOM, so beginning of month, users new, users churn, users active, and then the monthly revenue. And then with that, you have a monthly forecast for our users and the resulting revenue. Below here, I've also added a line and stack column chart. And this chart uses those revenue MRR total and users active AOM total measures. Those two measures combine the number of users or the revenue across the users from a different pricing plan. So you see that revenue MRR as a column and then that monthly users as a line. Finally, to show the split of users between those two pricing plans, I'd added the pricing plan field for my pricing plan lookup table. You will also notice that I've added a matrix with my annual users. For that, I put a year from the calendar table in my rows, and then I added those annual measures as my values. You can find those measures if you go back to my tutorial, and then if you scroll down, I've listed and explained those annual measures in more detail. So finally, with those forecast dashboard in place, we can use those parameters to test different forecast scenarios. So for example, you can test your forecast and see what happens to your revenues if you, let's say, increase your revenues for users on plan 1 from $20 to $25. You can see an increase of monthly revenues in your chart and also increase of the annual revenues on our annual matrix. Now, similarly, let's see what happens if we change the monthly churn from 6% to 9%. So that have a negative effect on your users and also on your revenues. You can also test the different assumptions like the share of users, the growth period, change the revenues for users on a different plan, same with the churn. To preview the dashboard, you can go back to my tutorial, and if you scroll down, you'll see that after our annual measures, I've added a recap, and then below that, you have a preview of the dashboard, which shows you again our actual numbers, the customer retention percentage by cohort on that heat map, then our area chart with the retention percentage for combined cohorts, and then finally our forecast dashboard with the parameters that you can change to see what happens to our forecast under different assumptions.
I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to download the dashboard or want to learn more about data analytics, follow the links in the description of this video, or if you have any questions, leave a comment below. To get in touch with me directly, go to my website at www.challengejp.com. Thank you very much.